Let's talk about App Engine. Now, App Engine is a platform as a service. It's fully managed. We're just going to deploy our code and get our jobs done, making our applications robust, integrated, whatever we have to do. It is, of course, hosted on Google's infrastructure, and it supports specific programming languages in the standard version. And if we don't meet the requirements for standard, we could always use flexible, and we'll talk more about that as well. And then there is an SDK kit where you could develop locally. A demo is on that, of course, coming up. As far as App Engine, it's a regional service. One of the things on the exam we're going to want to focus on is to know how to deploy App Engine, but also how to integrate App Engine. And this is a major part of the App Engine discussions throughout the course. And Memcache will be covered as well. Now, App Engine does have a software development kit. There's a demo on that, so review the SDK demo. We want to be aware that there's client libraries as well. They're listed there. I won't read them to you. There is, of course, a routine for getting the SDK installed. It's called gcloud init. We want to be able to tie in our Google account as well as our projects, and also set up authorization as well. Now, App Engine, platform as a service. In the background, it's a managed service, and as part of the managed service, the instances are health checked. Basically, what this means is Google, as part of the App Engine service, manages the availability of your instances and also allows you the ability to develop and not have to worry about the VM performance or anything like that. Now, you have the ability, of course, to manage your VMs. Google gives you that flexibility as well. It's up to you. But again, you may not want to deal with that. Now, the VM instances are located by geographic region. And again, it depends on how you set that in your project. So for example, if we need to deploy App Engine in Iowa in the US, we need to deploy that in the US, then we would choose whatever region makes sense. However, if we have application users overseas, then we need to deploy App Engine in a region that makes sense for that user base. We do have the ability to access the Compute Engine VMs as well. And App Engine generally just deploys, again, on Compute Engine. When we choose an environment, we have to make some decisions before we configure App Engine. So when we choose our region, we also want to select, do we deploy standard or flexible? Now, standard environment means that you're going to set up your instances in a sandbox. They're not using containers that you could deploy on or manage or anything. It's just running your runtime environment. It's basically an isolated environment that you're running. Now, the billing is different as well. That's another subject that we'll cover in the objectives coming up. But just be aware that App Engine, standard and flexible, are two different environments. Now, flexible is different in the sense that it's going to deploy Docker containers on Compute Engine. Now, standard version supports 2.7, 3.7. This is at the time of writing. You don't really need to know the versions or anything for the exam. You just want to be aware that if, for example, on the exam, we get an exam question that states, should the customer use App Engine and what version or deployment platform they should use in App Engine, standard or flexible, or environment, I should say, then we need to distinguish between standard and flexible. Now, if the customer requirements meets, for example, a specific version that's supported by standard, and they're not looking to deploy containers, then they could certainly go with standard. On the other hand, if the customer wants to use containers or use a version of Python or Java, whatever, that is not supported in standard, then we need to go with the flexible version. Now, flexible languages that are supported are here as well. So again, we can deploy any version of these languages that we should choose. Now, also as part of App Engine, there's what's called a cloud security scanner. This is a good way to mitigate issues before we deploy applications. We simply would want to deploy our application in the App Engine environment and run the scanner against it. It'll point out any kind of vulnerabilities, such as CSS script issues, etc. Now, when it comes to storing data on the exam, this is one of the areas that we're going to cover pretty much over and over throughout the course because, again, App Engine and Kubernetes Engine are the focus of the compute services and the services that tie in with these services. For example, Cloud Data Store. If we're storing schemaless data, such as NoSQL, Data Store may be the right choice. It is integrated. It's got API tie-ins with Data Store. So this is a great choice for like mobile profiles, perhaps. Again, we'll talk more about these services. Now, cloud storage. Again, this is really good for storing basically object data that doesn't have a basically a hierarchy to it. Cloud storage is really used as the ingestion point in a lot of services, for example, or applications, I should say. Now, Cloud SQL is meant for a relational database such as MySQL, for example. And again, we're going to talk more about these services as well throughout the course. We could also connect third-party services such as a database. I shouldn't say just database, but data type services such as Reddit, Mongo, Postgres, Hadoop, etc. Now, on the exam, generally what they like to do is give you a scenario, and then you need to choose, do I choose App Engine? And what are the data services do I use with App Engine to meet the customer requirement? So this is sort of the approach we want to consider on the exam. Now, App Engine scaling. App Engine scales, and we want to specify the scaling type and instance class that applies to every instance in the app.yaml file. The scaling type controls how instances are created. Now, again, we need to be specific on how we want to scale when we deploy. By default, of course, Google handles everything in a default approach, but we can specify how we want to scale as well. The instance class determines compute resources, for example, and pricing. When we deploy App Engine, the service is free. It's just that we need to pay for the resources we use. So if we use Compute Engine, App Engine, for example, uses Compute Engine. If we're using, for example, 4 instances of Compute Engine, we're paying for that on a use case basis. And then if we use Data Store along with it or cloud storage, we're also paying for that as well and any network bandwidth as well. So just be aware of that. Now, one of the things that you might want to highlight is that there's three scaling types. There's manual, basic, and automatic. The available instance classes depend on the scaling type. Again, on the exam, as part of App Engine, they want you to know how to scale App Engine, and that will appear to be a common theme on the exam, so just be warned. Another common theme on the exam are the different types of testing and traffic handling, for that matter. A/B testing. We're going to be talking a lot more about different testing approaches, etc., that can be used throughout the objective coverage in this course. Now, be aware that if we're looking at A/B testing, we need to consider, for example, traffic splitting. Traffic splitting is used to specify a distribution traffic between 2 or more versions. Now, we could split our traffic 50-50 if we want, but we have, for example, different options on how we split our traffic. We could use, for example, a cookie-based approach, an IP approach. We have some flexibility. We just don't have to split it 50-50. We could also change how we split our traffic. Traffic splitting is applied to the URLs that do not explicitly target a version. Now, one of the things to be aware of is that you need to have required privileges for this. And one of the things that you want to look at are the caching issues that can come out of this. This is how we could, again, split our traffic. We'll go into a demo on App Engine and talk more about this, of course. But again, that's just an example of how we'd want to accomplish this. And here's an example of A/B testing. You could see that there's 2 versions here that I have, and we could go ahead and split between version 1 and version 2. They're both running Python 2.7. And basically, we could go ahead and select the little icon there. That is the split traffic, and that would be our A/B testing. Now, traffic migration. We may have an issue in our application where maybe one region isn't performing the way we expected, or there's a huge traffic issue that came up for whatever reason. Maybe we want to, again, deal with an e-commerce site that's busy during a time of year, whatever that reason is. We may need to migrate traffic between versions, especially after we make a change. Or let's just say we're not going to even migrate traffic. We just may want to test out our new application. Traffic migration may accomplish that. So for example, A/B testing, A/B routing is also another term that's commonly used. We may have 2 different versions of the same app, but we call it basically version A and version B. For example, customers in this region go that way, customers in that region go to that version. On the other hand, we may want to make changes to our application, and therefore we may need to consider traffic migration strategies as well. Now, when it comes to standard and flexible environment, one of the things is to really think about this. So let me just state this a little different. One of the areas on the exam that is actually part of the objectives is to be able to distinguish how to route your traffic between different versions and how is it handled on standard or flexible. Now, they don't state this directly on the exam. It's part of the objectives, though, and the approach that they seem to use is, again, they give you a customer scenario, and they ask you what will be the best solution. Okay, so let's go ahead and sum this up. Do we use traffic migration or traffic splitting? Again, I have this in red because this is an area that I was surprised by the number of questions that I received on this. And I think this is an area that I find a lot of students get confused over with as well. And again, if you're not doing this every day, it could be confusing. But basically, think of traffic migration as a way to switch the requests between versions with a service of your application, within a service of your application. Basically, we're moving traffic from one or more versions to a single new version. Traffic splitting is where we take 2 or more versions, for example, for A/B testing, and this could also be called blue-green testing as well. We'll cover blue-green as well, because again, there's a lot of redundancy in terminology sometimes on how it's used. But basically, traffic splitting is applied to URLs that do not explicitly target a version. Now, for example, we may split traffic from one region and send it over to Europe if the IP addresses are coming from, let's say, Europe or Asia. If they're coming from North or South America, we may want to split traffic to go to a region in North America, whatever that rationale is. So on the exam, one of the things that caught me by surprise was, again, the scope and knowledge required around migration and traffic splitting. So just be warned on that. Okay, let's go ahead and sum up with a couple test tips here. A lot to cover on App Engine. There's a lot more to talk about on App Engine. We're just covering the basics of App Engine. We're not even into the deep dive yet in the objectives. So just be aware, App Engine has two environments. First of all, we know what they are, standard and flexible. App Engine is a regional service. Again, remember that. We can't migrate one region to another. We can't, have a multi-regional App Engine service. Again, we can't change the region after we set it as well. Now, each instance, there is an initial start of up to 15 minutes instance time. That is in the flexible environment. So just be aware of that. Consider the location of your products as well. When I say products, I mean GCP services that we're using. For example, if we deploy App Engine, one of the things you're going to want to think about is the region that we deploy it in, but also what about the other services we deploy with App Engine? Do we want to have those services in the same region? For example, Cloud SQL, Cloud Data Store. Some services are global, some are more regional than others. Cloud storage. And then we absolutely want to know A/B testing and migration as well. Let's move on.